Story 1: The Flickering Shadows. It was a cold October night, and Emily was staying alone in her parents' old Victorian house, which creaked and groaned with every gust of wind. She was used to the sounds by now. After all, she'd grown up here, and the creaks were as familiar as her own heartbeat. But tonight felt different. The air was heavy, and an unsettling feeling crept over her, like a cold shiver. Emily glanced at the clock. 3 a.m. She tried to shake off the unease, telling herself it was just another sleepless night. She took a deep breath, hoping to lull herself back into slumber, when suddenly she noticed a flicker in the hallway. The light outside her bedroom door was dimming and brightening, almost as if someone was walking past it. But Emily knew she was alone. It must be a faulty bulb, she whispered to herself, her voice barely a murmur. She wrapped herself in a blanket and slowly got out of bed, trying not to make a sound. She reached the hallway, looking at the flickering bulb with a frown, then realized it wasn't just the bulb. Shadows seemed to dance along the walls, strange, untwisted, moving as if they had a life of their own. She stared transfixed, her pulse quickening. She reached for the light switch, flicking it up and down, but the shadows continued their eerie dance, moving in ways that defied explanation. Her breath hitched. It was then she saw the shadow that seemed to detach itself from the wall, growing larger and more defined as it slowly turned toward her. She couldn't make out a face, but she felt it staring, watching her, with an intensity that chilled her to the bone. Emily took a step back, her mind racing. Was this a prank, a trick of the light? She told herself. She was imagining things, but as the shadow moved closer, she heard a faint whisper in her ear. Emily, she froze. The voice was familiar, her father's voice calling her name, just like he used to when she was a child. But her father had passed away years ago. She clutched her blanket tightly, feeling trapped in a nightmare. She couldn't wake up from. "Dad," she called out, her voice trembling. The whisper came again, closer, this time sounding anguished, as though he were in pain. She backed into her room, shutting the door and locking it behind her. Her heart was racing as she pressed her ear against the door, trying to listen for any more sounds. But the house was silent. Just as she started to calm down, there was a loud knock on her door. The sound was so sharp and sudden that she jumped back, letting out a gasp. She waited, praying it was just her imagination. But the knock came again, harder this time, followed by that same agonized whisper. She backed against the wall, terrified, as the door began to slowly creak open, revealing the dark, twisted shadow beyond. It loomed into the room, stretching toward her. And as she stared, she saw her father's face form in the darkness, hollow and haunting. She screamed, clutching the blanket around her, but the shadow's icy touch silenced her. Everything went black. The next morning, neighbors found her huddled in the corner of her room, pale and unresponsive, mumbling one word over and over again: "Dad." Story to the addicts: secrets. Liam had just moved into an old house in the countryside, hoping for a fresh start. The house was charming in a way, though it had a reputation of being haunted. But Liam didn't believe in ghosts. That was until he woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of footsteps coming from the attic, directly above his bedroom. He tried to ignore it, rolling over and burying his head in the pillow. But the footsteps grew louder, heavier, as if someone were pacing back and forth. Curiosity got the better of him. and he decided to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight and carefully climbed the rickety ladder to the attic, his footsteps echoing in the silence. As he reached the top, he hesitated. The attic was pitch black, filled with dust and cobwebs. His flashlight illuminated old furniture and cardboard boxes, but nothing unusual. He let out a sigh of relief, thinking maybe it was just the house settling. But as he turned to leave, he heard a faint whisper, "Help me." He whipped around, shining the flashlight in every corner of the attic, his heart pounding. But no one was there. The whisper came again, louder this time, like someone was right behind him. "Help me," Liam stumbled back, nearly tripping over a box. He wanted to run to escape, but the pleading voice seemed to root him to the spot. Then he saw it, a figure crouched in the corner, barely visible in the dim light. A young girl, with hollow eyes and a face twisted in sorrow. "Please help me," she whispered. Again, her voice filled with desperation. What do you want?" he stammered, his throat dry. She pointed to the floor, and he noticed a small trapdoor, hidden beneath the dust and grime. Summoning his courage, he pulled it open, revealing a small hidden compartment. Inside he found a dusty diary and an old locket. As he opened the diary, he discovered the tragic story of a girl who had once lived in the house, who had disappeared mysteriously one night, never to be seen again. Before he could react, the girl's figure was right in front of him, her hollow eyes piercing into his soul. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice fading as she disappeared into thin air. When morning came, Liam left the house shaken, but determined to learn more about the girl's story. From that day on, the footsteps in the attic stopped, but he could still feel her presence, watching over him, grateful for finally being remembered. Story 3: The Mirror's Reflection. Jenna was staying at her grandparents' house, which had been abandoned for years. She'd inherited the house recently and decided to spend a few nights there to sort through old belongings and memories. She was exhausted from the day's work, falling into a deep sleep, until a loud noise startled her awake. She glanced at the clock, 3 a.m. The noise had come from the bathroom. A loud crash that sounded like glass shattering. She hesitated, the silence feeling oppressive, but curiosity drove her to investigate. She crept down the dark hallway, feeling every creak underfoot, until she reached the bathroom. The mirror above the sink was shattered, the shards scattered across the floor. She stared at it in confusion. How could it have broken on its own? She was about to turn away when she noticed something. In the reflection of the cracked glass, a figure standing right behind her, smiling. Jenna gasped and spun around, but there was no one there. Her heart pounded as she turned back to the mirror, but the figure was still there. A pale, grinning woman with hollow eyes, watching her through the fractured glass. "Believe," the figure whispered, her voice echoing eerily in the small bathroom. Jenna backed out of the room, slamming the door shut, her mind racing. She tried to convince herself it was a nightmare, a hallucination, but the image of that grinning woman was burned into her mind. As she stood in the hallway, she could hear the faint, mocking laughter coming from the other side of the door. She stumbled back to her room, locking the door and pulling the covers over her head, like a frightened child. But just as she started to calm down, she heard the soft, steady tapping on her bedroom mirror. She forced herself to look, her heart sinking. as she saw the woman's face staring back at her, pressing her hands against the glass, as though trying to break through. Jenna's voice caught in her throat as the figure's grin widened, and she heard a whisper, barely audible, coming from the mirror. "You can't escape, I'm here." "Always watching," Jenna screamed, clutching her head, and in that moment, the glass shattered and everything went dark. When she woke the next morning, she was lying on the floor, in front of the broken mirror, her reflection the only thing staring back at her. But the memory of that haunting grin never faded, and she could swear every time she glanced in a mirror, she could still see those hollow eyes watching, waiting for the perfect moment to return.